and it evolved very, very fast. So what we're kind of seeing is the question, what do you want to do for music, become easier for each new generation of music students, which is very cool to see, because it's hard. It's very, very hard. So when we talk about, well, not talk about rather, or anybody talks about like the prioritization, the privilege that comes, there's a group that is a racialized group and a socially identifiable group that seems to continue to be pushed on top. If we want to,
I'm not in a public school. You can say it here, Joe.
Yeah.
The white people won't be feeling guilty.
Yeah. So like, and that's the thing, right? It's like you gotta like start like. It's like this, like you gotta like take it like a step, like okay, like step 1, okay, they're good, no objections. Step 2, okay, good, no objections. So step 3, okay, no objections, and then you put in male there. It's like okay, a little hot on the floor, but and then it's lava. It goes from hot sauna.
Oh, that's where it went. Oh, we're backing up.
Yeah, you're.
Wait, what?
I have no idea what's going on right now. What if I do this? Okay, that works.
Oh, that's perfect. Oh my gosh, hang on, wait. I'm gonna pull you up. I'm on it. To double check, what are your pronouns?
He, him.
All right, just
not he, him, but he, him.
That is fair. That is fair. How are you doing today?
I'm pretty okay. Doing pretty okay. A couple fires here and there, but that's all right. If it's not a day where you wake up and there isn't like 10 fires you got to put out, then what's the point?
Fair enough.
Yeah.
All right. I'm just adjusting a few things real quick, and we will be ready to go. Oh my gosh. I am so glad you made the time to join us today.
Yeah, it's going to be fun, I think. I hope.
Oh, I think so.
Oh no, not that button. Oh my goodness.
Wait, what?
I'm trying to fix something and it's not working. Oh, hold on. No, nothing on your end. It's just my end's all. There we go. I changed things around, and I changed the names of lights in my room because we're in the future and you can do that. And it's like, oh, change it to turn it on and off. I got to turn off my bed light. But I don't feel like changing it.
Fuzzy in your beard.
I have everything in my beard. Like, it's been a long day.
Beards are wild. No, I feel ya. I'm like, I had just barely made it into this conversation.
There have been times where you ever in a social setting, you get there, but you can tell somewhere deep down, I probably look like a psycho right now. Or there's like something, and nobody ever wants to address it, so they just kind of let it rock. Like, oh, it's just how they just feel today. It's like, no, if my shirt is unbuttoned, 5 buttons off, that's the part where you tell me.
Well, as you see, I've got your back. I have you.
Yeah.
By the way,
I don't know what you're saying. Sorry.
Speaking of which, I love your shirt.
Oh, thank you.
It's incredible.
I try to dress up a little bit, right? Start from because of the top up, right? So we got to make sure that we're presenting well over the top.
I definitely hear you. It's kind of funny to have you here after we, banned you.
Oh yeah. Well, that was it's almost a year anniversary of that, actually.
Really?
Yeah.
It's been a year since I banned you.
It's been a year. I was sniped so fast.
My mods do not play. Do you want to explain what happened?
Yeah. So I was doing at the time. Well, there's a lot of context to it, but at the time I was doing a pseudo donation drive for my rent, and it was like. First off, it's COVID, and there's a lot of restrictions for COVID, so like it was just kind of like hey, you guys want to help, you can. And someone dropped like a G just randomly. I still don't know who it was. And the person who did it cited a bunch of content creators. So initially, I thought it was like just a global effort of people of just coming together. And so, like, I was talking about a bunch of other stream, like, basically, like, thanking every content creator because basically, regardless if it was like a group effort or not, it was just like one person who felt like because of other people's influence, they felt the influence to donate to me. So I was like, you know what? Like, who's streaming among these people they thanked? All right. Lumi's streaming, let's just fucking to the moon. So I sent that over, and I sent my community over to yours, and I was sending a thank you message. Then I think it was like I was typing like "you're the fucking shit," but it came out as "your shit," and it just got clipped like immediately.
Yeah, our mods are like, nope. No.
And then it was like, and then the conflict of interest, like, wait, no, this is like, don't ban Joe. It's not a big deal.
That's so funny.
Yeah, it was pretty funny.
And now you're here. Thank you so much for joining us. Because I know today's fairly busy. Don't you have, like, it's your first marching band rehearsal?
Yes, the first day. The first day back. And then because of our doing state stuff, now it's less stressful. At the start of the day, it was stressful. Over time, it's getting less stressful, right? So we didn't have PPE yet for the students, and we just found that out today. So now we can only have non-wins come in. So that kind of reduces the size of people coming. So it's a little bit less stressful. But now there's just the stress of getting kids protective equipment. So now it's just guard, drumline, and drum majors. But still, like the first day, everybody's like back in like a capacity of rehearsal, so everyone's really excited. So I've seen my emails of sad parents, and I'm like, you know what, I'm gonna deal with you y'all at like 5:00, okay?
Oh yeah, that's gotta be rough.
Yeah, I mean, as a student, I'd be like, based, no rehearsal, all right. But yeah, some are kind of like, oh, like I can't wait for the next one. It's like, yeah, it's great. It's gonna be great.
Absolutely. So, do you teach high school music then?
Yeah. So I'm there at the high school as one of the assistant directors. Well, not one of the only. So it's myself. So our staff is our band director, myself as the assistant. Then we have a guard director, and then a drumline tech or director, I should say. So it's 4 of us.
Do you teach any courses? What exactly do you do?
Yeah, so with the marching band there, I'll start there and then work backwards, right? So with the high school, I'm there in the assistant director capacity. So that is a bunch of just anything and everything, right? So basically, if the director can't do it, it ends up being my responsibility. But it ends up being, because of my expertise, I work a lot with the woodwinds primarily. And it's fun. And there's kind of like a little bit of lore. I started out with them as a woodwind tech. So like I did that for 4 years, 3, something like that, 2 or 3. And then I transitioned to being assistant director. And this is my second year in that position. And it's a lot of fun. So like we do shows of that. It leaks over into other things over the school year. So like if there's something that they need me for, whether it be musical wise or otherwise, I usually get a call for that. And then pulling it back from there, I also work in the district as a 10-month substitute, which normally, under normal conditions, is like, oh, you get a call for like a job in the district and you can go do that if you want. And that's part of my job. The other part is what they call, my official quote unquote title is a substitute study hall proctor. So there's a national sub shortage across all states.
Yeah.
And yeah, so what my district decided to do as a resolution was to create a study hall for substitute classes instead of having substitutes at the high school level. So what that looks like is if your teacher's out, instead of going to the classroom for a substitute there, you go to the study hall and the teacher does or submits work remotely. It's very, very rare in our district of a teacher being out sick. So if they are out, they're out for some type of administrative purpose or something else. So usually it's just kind of like it was basically remote learning before it got cool, if you know what I mean. Cool and hip, and everybody started doing it. Because we're a Google school, so like everybody's was on Chrome before COVID started, so things were still kind of like we got lucky. Let's put it that way. So that ended up being this year. We started out doing substitute study halls, and then it ended up being proctor study halls. So my responsibility was basically watching kids watch Zoom for the school year. But it's good for my position because it keeps me in the school for the entire year, but also allows like different things because the big thing about my district is that they want to make sure that the teachers who are in extracurriculars are also in the school at some capacity. So it creates like a relationship there. So that works out really well.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That's awesome.
And then also too, just because I feel bad because I'm kind of a no nonsense individual. So it's funny because I guess like I'm gonna get to it a little bit. Like one of my biggest things is I just want the question. I don't want the problem. So what that looks like a lot of the times is my students who work with me know that, but then since I'm in this sort of substitute study hall proctor, they don't know that. So sometimes it kind of puts them kind of off foot because what happened before was a lot of the substitute proctors they had in the past would kind of like let students get away with stuff. So what that looks like is they'll say like, "Oh, I'm just gonna go to the library," and they don't go to the library. And so
like, I know what you're doing.
Yeah, it's funny because it keeps them sharp, but I just like being that asshole. Like, so it's like they'll be like, Mr. Joe, because first off, there's two things. My band students can call me Joe. I don't really care, but everybody else can't, and that's kind of like the golden rule. So sometimes I get the Mr. Joe, and it's like, all right, let's party. Because that means they're like one of their friends is like a band, is like one of their friends is one of my students. So let's say something like, I don't have my book for the class. I was like, okay. And then there's that pause, and it's like, can I go to the library and get it? And one of the rules within study hall, like within the study hall thing, is like you can't go to the library because it's like just an accountability thing. So I told them like I can't let you go because there's no guarantee that there's no guarantee that you'll be back, and two, they'll just send you back anyway. And they're like, well, can I try? And it's like I'm telling you, they will send you back. It's not a matter of like maybe you'll like get the book. It's like once you walk in, they'll send you back. Yeah. And they go like, well, can I at least try it? And I'm like, okay. So I sign the pass, write it in, give it to them, and then 5 minutes later, it's like, oh yeah, they sent me back. I'm like, I know. and then that's the conversation that you sit down. Yeah, it's just like, and that might tie into something like to another part of like how I roll with things. But yeah, it's just kind of it's fun in that regard. But yeah, that's a sidebar.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's really cool though. I know you love string players. I got into the violin. And couldn't get into the marching band because obviously you don't march with the violin.
Right.
But that education around the violin, just having music in my life was deeply, deeply impactful to me. And as I've moved forward, going through, we had some music education throughout my K through 12. I didn't take it very seriously, and I didn't feel like a lot of people did take it very seriously. But as I've grown older, I've realized like that is incredibly, incredibly valuable. Do you feel like people... Like, how have you felt people have treated music education when you were younger, and how do you feel they value it now? And do you feel valued in your position?
Oh boy. First off, I'll say I love my job. Please don't fire me. But I totally love my job. I'm totally doing it without any coercion or bribery. But anyway, jokes aside. I'm half serious, by the way. But so pulling back to like I guess my musical background, not to flex, but I was always musically gifted. So what that looks like in hindsight, I can say that. At the time, I didn't really understand that. I just liked music, so I just did it a lot when I was younger.
Mm-hmm.
What that does is when you have like a strong interest in something and it doesn't feel like a task, you just kind of have like a natural ability to things. So I was always just doing it just to do it. So I never really thought of it as anything that was serious per se, which helped in some regards. It helped when I first started auditioning for things because I didn't treat it like it was this serious thing. As I learned the hard way, my district, not really my district, but my district as it relates to the entire like central New Jersey is incredibly competitive. And we have a lot of, if not some of the best music schools in the state. And then I get my only dumbass coming from a high school that never really like I wouldn't say took instrumental bands seriously, but we never had a lot of like exceptional musicians come out of the program and go on to do things like music ed and stuff like that. We're kind of like few and far between. So what that looked like was I kind of treated it very casually. I still do to an extent. But for a teacher teaching me, I was unbearable. Mainly because there was just like, I just challenged the system a bit in ways that I didn't really understand because it was like kind of, if I were to word this thought properly, there's expectations that a teacher has of a student. And sometimes teachers kind of have a mutual understanding where certain goals just aren't met given the timelines given. As an example, my freshman year, I went to the first rehearsal of marching band without any music because I had it all memorized. Because one of the things that like was like kind of drilled into our head early through like mini camp and stuff, like your music has to be memorized by the first rehearsal, like that type of. They didn't really say that, but it's kind of like the first rehearsal is like when you kind of want to make sure you're comfortable with things. So I had the whole thing memorized. So I'm up there as a freshman, and there's already drama because I got into wind ensemble, which is like the largest. Like not the largest, but like the more like selective group, and I made second chair, and then I find out. In hindsight, not in hindsight, but I find out after the fact that I scored above and beyond everybody who auditioned. But because I was a freshman, they put me second chair. So there was a lot of like drama with that because I was in an entire section of all seniors, and I kicked one of the freshmen, one of the seniors who was supposed to like who thought their seat was guaranteed out of the ensemble. And I knew that, and just people thought like
right away.
Yeah, and then people thought like because of the instrument and because of like the abnormality of it, like oh, it's just some like Asian kid or something, and then you see it's just like this little only like chunky little black kid coming in, not knowing the drama of any of the situation. But anyway, so I come in there again, like treating it very unseriously, and the director comes up to me and he's like, "Where's your music?" And I said, "I don't need it." And he's like, why don't you need it? I was like, I have it memorized. And he's like, okay, play. And he meant some obscure measure. I don't know. I played it. and then like, it was just this awkward situation of him and I looking at each other like, so now what? and then like he could,
I dare you.
yeah. And it was, and the thing was in the moment, I was just like, he asked me to do something, so I did it. But from the outside looking in, it's like, who's this cocky motherfucker coming in here? First day of rehearsal, not even camp, not even mini camp, but just like summer rehearsals coming in music memorized. And just the whole time I was like, that's just not what you're supposed to do. So I've always sort of approached music in a very, not passive way, but I took a lot of like, moments to remind me how serious it was for a lot of people. So I just kind of treated it as a fun thing to do. Like it hit me, like when I didn't get accepted into region ensemble, I think it was like my junior year, like really hit me where it's like, that's when I was like, for me, that's when I was like, okay, this is more serious than I thought it was going to be. Mainly because like I thought like, it's just a thing. I'm like, I was in it the last year and I'm like, oh, I'll just do the same thing I did again. And it didn't happen. And then that was when like, okay, like I have to start, I can still have fun, but there's a level of seriousness that comes with in terms of work ethic and stuff like that. Thankfully, it was in a very supportive district where we have the facilities and stuff like that to be able to do things like practice during study halls or practice during lunch, in a very open format with that. Because a lot of my time was spent in the banner and gym, because gym is pretty based. But then moving forward into college, because I went to community college first, I just had no idea what I wanted to do. I liked music. I sucked academically. I was bad. And it wasn't because, and in hindsight, what I realized, it wasn't because I was necessarily a bad student, but I kept getting put in these sort of boxes, and the rhetoric around my academic success was pretty rough when I think about it in hindsight. Because basically they're like, okay, Joe's talented in music. This is the thing that he's good at. So we have to make sure like this is nurtured. But in that nurturing in the early 2000s, music, it's not to say that music education wasn't always a path that you went to, but for a lot of people, it's still kind of stigmatized. Where like, oh, you're going to school for music? What does that mean? Like, what are you going to school for music for? Like,
exactly.
What?
Yeah.
And for me, it took me a while to kind of center what that was. It ended up being like this, where I'm at now, was nowhere near where I wanted to be, because I hated marching band in high school. Hated it. And what I found now is that a lot of my dislike towards some things musically came from my directors. They were great people and influential, but they were kind of dicks. So
sorry to hear.
And and it happens. Like, it's no fault of their own. I think it's just product of what I call like the old guard of how things were kind of done. Because I don't know how old you are, but during the 2000s, we kind of had a metamorphosis of, do kids have feelings? Yeah, we should probably look at those better, right?
Oh no! Oh no!
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm gonna be honest. Like, when people talk about how, like, in terms of, and this might be a side tangent for another conversation. Like, when people talk about the idea of like, oh, if you get bullied, you can talk to someone. That didn't happen in my high school. You just held that. Like, I vividly remember like times where I was definitely harassed, and it was just compartmentalized in such a way where it just was the thing that happened. Like, there is like a bullying procedure, but talking to a counselor about it, nah. Like,
we will have to dive into that more.
Yeah.
I have a feeling we'll have a few conversations if you're down to join me again.
Yeah.
But how do you feel like music education is valued now?
It's much like the bullying policies in schools, night and day. There's still some stigmatization when it comes to the path of music. But I think there's a much better understanding that music can go anywhere. So when a student says they want to go to school for music, that's great. But a lot that might happen in college and after is kind of accelerated. What that looks like is, for music, and this took me a long time to really get my head around. I really only got my head around this when I was I'm 32 now, like maybe when I was 25 or so, where there's no waiting in terms of figuring out what you want to do. And what that looks like is, if you're going through music education, there's a very clear regimented path. Like, you go to college, you do all the stuff, you do the observation, you get your placement, which essentially is an internship for student teaching. If you do really well in your student teaching, that could propel you to other jobs, maybe that are opening up. But there's very like a clear like path of like X, Y, Z, and then, okay, you're a teacher. And I went to a college after in Kane University, and I'll dox myself on that because Kane is based. It's one of the best music education programs in the state. It also is one of the most under-resourced music education programs in the state. So like Montclair, I love you guys, gals and non-binary pals, but you can You can have a good day. Okay, you're gonna have a great day. But yeah, there's competition there. But my point there is that when you're going from music BA, which was my degree, there was a very no one really. Every teacher I had pushed this idea, but they never really articulated it. Where it's like, what are you gonna do for work? And it's like, oh, I'm just gonna do music, right? And it's like, okay, what's the plan to do that? And as we kind of saw in the later 2000s, that it's kind of evolved in a really fast way, which is incredible. The advent of decent music technology has allowed certain things that were gate-kept by education, gate-kept by cost to be easily accessible. It started, and if I had to pinpoint a industry where it started, was with DJs. Like the DJ controller, the first one being, I don't remember the name of it, but DJ Tech Tools has a really good history about that. That was in the first DJ controller that you could use those portables in 07.
Oh yeah,
and that was
you DJ too? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
What? This is so cool. Can we find that anywhere? I know that's probably not possible, but uh-oh. Did we lose?
Can you hear me? See me?
Oh, I lost you for a second, but you're back.
Okay.
You're good.
There you go. Yeah, it just started raining over here, so there might be a small cut. Am I still here? I think?
Yeah, you're good. We're cool.
Okay, good. Yeah. So with the advent of DJ equipment and then the advent of powerful home computers, it kind of pushed everything to be available to the masses, and it evolved very, very fast. So what we're kind of seeing is the question, what do you want to do for music, become easier for each new generation of music students, which is very cool to see, because it's hard. It's very, very hard. And something that's is kind of tricky is, and I kind of ran into this during COVID, because I spent about from 25 to still now kind of setting myself up in a way where I could do music full time while also still having other means of income to make sure I sustain myself. Mm-hmm. And that's something that I wish I told myself when I was in my 20s. Figure that part out. Don't complain about your union job that's part-time. Look, so much stuff. Because in hindsight, the things were there, but I didn't really see them. An example that I give a lot when people talk about unions, I was making $18 an hour part-time as a union worker for a grocery store. And I started out. Yeah. And why was my wage so high? Union contracts. And there was 3 times where I got fired. Why didn't I get fired? Union protections, where I was trying to get fired on some bullshit and the union saved my ass. Now, obviously, a union versus Walmart is a pretty hard matchup, but it's I didn't really think about the idea of saving money for myself in terms of doing something for music. I was just kind of having a job because I needed to sustain myself for other things. The idea of saving wasn't really implemented in me, and it's no one's fault it's anyone's fault. It's just kind of where I was mentally at the time. Mm-hmm. So when all that stuff happened, when AMP went bankrupt in 2011 and I was out of a job collecting unemployment as a 19-year-old, it's okay, this is a new phenomena. And to fast forward, I guess let's segue it back to music. I think the options for musicians in order to do what they want to do, it's way easier to sort of pick your path and find a place to start. Where when I was in school and college, it was a bit harder, where you kind of had to have hard talks where it's you want to be a musician, but you're probably going to have to work a job that has nothing to do with music in order to sustain yourself for the long game of being able to support yourself. Mm-hmm. Now, I turned that into positioning myself in a way where I could always how do I say this in a way that makes sense? Be somebody who you cannot replace. So I learned how to DJ. I learned how to use music software. I learned how to use things like Word, Excel, PowerPoint. Adobe very, very well. I looked into things like Final Cut. I got into video production in that aspect. I got into VJing, which is basically the same thing as DJing, but just with video content. I also play horn. So like I started getting into pop music more and understanding like how to play not only pop horn, but just maybe just music more broadly. So I put a lot of hats and worked on a lot of hats to put myself in the situations where if somebody needs something, for instance, like a videographer for a wedding, I could do that. If somebody needs a saxophonist for like a proposal or something, right? I can do that. So I will say, so that way, like I basically try to turn myself into the best gig worker that I could be, because that was kind of like the world I accepted I was going to live in. Now, then marching band came in and became like a consistent thing that exists in the in between. So I'm able to do something and advocate for something because I'm really passionate about music education. So like I'm still in music, but I'm in music in a bunch of different ways, which allows me to kind of see things from a different perspective than being kind of stuck in sort of like the regimented like go to school for music, go to college for music, graduate, and then just like sometimes maybe not do nothing with it, or just go down the traditional education route. Because while I love education, ask this question again when I'm 40, but the classroom is not there for me yet. I love being able to do private instruction. I love being able to work in the marching arts capacity. I mean, when I get older, I'll start falling in love with kindergarten again. But for now, that's where I'm at.
I gotcha. Thank you. You do
long more.
You do a lot. Like, you're out there teaching. You can DJ, all this other stuff, and still you're managing to be on Twitch streaming. I've seen you've been covering critical race theory a lot, which is probably quite relevant, being in an education field and everything. I know that they've been banning the teaching of critical race theory in different places, and that's already affecting schools, already affecting classes. I've seen the absurd fear-mongering that happened around this seemed silly to me. Like, I felt I could just dismiss it. All the Republicans are being wild, and then we're seeing these bans come down, and I'm like, it's already affecting discussions, any discussion on race in schools. This seems really serious. As someone who has really benefited from discussions of race happening in classroom settings, like, that's really concerning. So what's your take on everything that's happening?
Yeah, so not to scare anybody, but there's two wars being fought at the same time. And that, I think, is the important distinction about this problem. Very unique problem, actually, if I'm being quite honest. Normally, when people are against certain studies or practices, there's a very clear line to where it comes from. And this discourse is a very clear line of where it comes from. But what's interesting about it is that CRT, and how do I say this in a way that's going to make a lot of sense? CRT and gender identity are being fought at the exact same time. And the laws implemented are encapsulating both at the same time. So let me kind of, it sounds a little bit nebulous, but let me walk through this. So I just pulled up on my side the restrictions, because the one thing that I love about Republicans, they copy each other's homework. So within all, like, which is great for the ACLU, because you can just fight one and fight them all. But when it comes to the rhetoric, it kind of understands where they're at, right? So I'm just going to run it down real quick. So here's an example of, I'll put it in your chat as well, which requires me doing a lot of boomer stuff. Okay. I hope this works. I'm so old when it comes to computers. So this is
that deep in my heart.
Yeah. So the thing that I'm going to send over, hopefully, is House Bill 1775 from Oklahoma. And this is in law. So every bill that's being introduced is a variation of this text. which is no student, administrator, or other employee or school district, charter school, or virtual charter school shall require or make part of a course the following concepts. And I would argue that these concepts are not necessarily controversial, right? One of them is one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds unobjectable. An individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive, whether consciously or unconsciously. And it's like, okay, we have like conscious and unconscious bias kind of getting targeted, but it's under a very like specific frame. And it's like, all right, well, let's keep going. An individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his or her race or sex. And my point here is that these tenets that they're targeting,
it's targeting women's studies too.
Yeah, and it also has nothing to do with critical race theory. So what happens in the discourse is you'll hear people talk about gender pronouns, and it's a very uncontroversial thing that they're fighting against, which is it's very simple. If a student affirms their gender to be X, then it's X.
And we can all chill and be fine. Like, it's fine. It's all vibes and chill.
So exactly, it's like, okay, so because before, right, and this is still very nebulous, and I would strongly recommend everybody within your community to double check how each individual school district deals with gender affirmation. But very generally, a teacher can ask a student for their pronouns. Mm-hmm. So what that leads to is a lot of ambiguity on rosters. And as somebody who's still as the meme is, the district that I'm in is majority Asian, and majority Asian as in all of it within the categorization of what people consider Asian. So we have students from Pakistan, India, Iran, Iraq, China, North Korea, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines. Like, it makes for a very incredible melting pot of students, but a name and roster nightmare in that I can't pronounce names, and all my students know, and they all make fun of me at this point. So like what happens is what I'm used to, and this is going to kind of tie into gender, is like I'll go through the roster, say someone's name, and they'll correct me, and like I'll say the correction. It's like, okay, cool, we're done. But with gender, it's a bit more complicated because you can't overtly ask somebody's gender identity. Now, there's ways that we can know through inference, where I guess the word's inference, where if we know that a student, because through other expressions, express their gender differently than what their gender is assigned at birth, then that's fine. Like, we know that as like it's like kind of public information. Mm-hmm. For example, if they came up and did a speech of something, like, you can use that as a reference. So like if you can pinpoint that, it's usually a lot easier. Most of the time, the students who are gender, like, if they have a gender that's different than their gender assigned at birth, or their gender non-conforming, or whatever, we know it in advance because they tell us. But if we can't ask that, and that's the kind of like the general consistency across each school district. However, there's kind of the fight of, if my child identifies as something different than their gender assigned at birth, what can they do? And that's where things get kind of weird. So on one hand, in some districts, in some states, if your child identifies as something outside of their gender assigned at birth, you can actually get it changed on their record. Same with their if they have, for instance, like a dead name. I have a lot of students with dead names. Like, so what happens in our roster, they can choose to, if they would like to, have their dead name. It still exists on their roster, but for representative purposes, it would have their name that they choose to identify as. Mm-hmm. So like, not to, like, for instance, it would be like, for my case, it would be something like, let's say if I chose my name to be Matt instead. It would say, like, on the roster, Matt, like, open parentheses, Joe, underlined. or Joseph underlined, and then Lewis. So we know like the name that's like out of parentheses is the name that they're using. Inside is the one for professional and like health purposes, and then their last name. When I say health purposes, that just means if like the popo kicks a door in and asks for Joseph, it's like they're over there, like that type of thing. For gender, it's way more complicated because for gender, it's the same thing depending on what state you're in, but you have to go through about 9,000 hoops and ladders to get that changed. And then sometimes when it's changed, it's going to vary from what state you're in. Some states are very easy, where you can just the parent can choose to change it, and then that's it. So in other districts in other states, the parent can choose to, the child can choose to just have it be that. And it is so. And the parent sometimes can't even interject in terms of like revising it on the record. Because it's basically like what the student affirms to be, which I think is probably going to be the path forward macro. But micro, there's this fight of this idea, to quote a Loudoun County school teacher who's currently suspended and fighting his suspension in court. He doesn't feel the need to lie to children about their gender, which is the weirdest thing to say.
Is this in New Jersey?
This is in Loudoun County, Virginia, which is the precipice or center point of the CRT conversation. Because they're the loudest district fighting it right now, which, like we'll get to probably later, it's also a district that has a gubernatorial election. So, so my concern is that when these individuals are making these bills and using this type of language, it's trying to, one, target a problem that doesn't exist, and two, try to target other social issues that don't exist. Not that they don't exist, let me rephrase that. They exist, but they don't exist in the way that they're framing these laws.
Yeah.
Like what the, like, as a way, like how, what are the restrictions under the Oklahoma bill? And again, I want to make this as clear as possible. The language within this bill in terms of the tenets from A through H exist in some variation in almost every single bill being introduced. And almost all of them are in law. So like how would a teacher teach that an individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his or her sex or race? And then also, what author is making that argument?
Yeah.
So like, it's literally just an essentialization boogeyman or woman or whatever they choose to identify in the boogie world, but it just doesn't exist. And then, sorry, go for it.
It almost feels like they're saying we're essentializing people when we're trying to do exactly the opposite. And
Correct.
Trying to address the systemic problems. It's so bizarre. It's just a total misframing. Same with like, oh, we're trying to make white people feel guilty. Like, I feel like you're just projecting.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I literally feel like you're just projecting. I went through these conversations and I didn't feel guilty. I felt a sense of responsibility. I'm sorry that's hard for you. But
yeah, exactly. Like in the way that I was in Chudlot's extreme talking about it, where it's like, it's one thing to say that because of how society is socially constructed, there's certain people within that social construction that get their needs, expectations, wants, and desires prioritized.
Mm-hmm.
That prioritization does not mean a guarantee, right? Mm-hmm. So when we talk about, or anybody talks about like the prioritization, the privilege that comes, there's a group that is a racialized group and a socially identifiable group that seems to continue to be pushed on top. If we want to,
I'm not in a public school. You can say it here, Joe.
Yeah.
The white people won't be feeling guilty.
Yeah. So like, and that's the thing, right? It's like you gotta like start like. It's like this, like you gotta like take it like a step, like okay, like step one, okay, they're good. No objections. Step 2, okay, good, no objections. So step 3, okay, no objections. And then you put in male there. It's like, oh, okay, a little hot on the floor, but
True.
and then you add white, and then it's lava. It goes from hot
You're
sauna.
oh, that's where it went. Oh, we're backing up.
Yeah, and like my frustration is that there's nothing, and this might, to quote Charles V. Hamilton, there's nothing like, or rather, let me say what he said, essentially verbatim. White people have to stop feeling bad about being racially identifiable. And to elaborate on that a little bit, is that because we understand that race is socially constructed and intersectionality is a thing, we're going to have to be very particular about the individuals that we talk about and the groups of people that we talk about. And for the longest time, and unfortunately, there's a lot of history to back it up, racially identifiable white men have been on top. And you can deny that because of your personal experience. That doesn't diminish intersectionality. It's just the fact of life. Now, because of certain privileges, prioritization can be different because of a different social and racial privileges. So you're going to have poor white people. You're going to have white men. Like, you're going to have white men who also experience.
Oh, we lost you for a minute. The rain's got him. The rain or the CRT banner. Oh, I hear laughter. Well, there we are. Welcome back. I thought the CRT banning people got you. They're like, oh, this is where it goes too far.
I said the spiciest part there before the break. So like the point that I was trying to make was that certain social privilege, like because of how society constructs itself, just because you might be a member of that categorized group doesn't mean you don't have disadvantages when you're within that group, right? It's no different when you hear like there's the, how do I say this? There's the, to tie it into gender identity a little bit, there is the uncomfortable conversation that should be had about men's rights. However, it's impossible to talk about the strife and struggle of men without talking about women and the perspective and stories of women and them presenting individuals in the forefront. It's impossible.
Our liberations are tied together.
Yeah. And that's incredibly important. But what happens is when you get into these men's rights circles, it's rough. It's rough.
Are you familiar with men's liberation?
A little bit, yeah.
We dive
I've walked into, it's funny because it's something that has been on my mind as a black educator, a black male educator, in that there's just kind of multiple, again, intersectionality doesn't stop existing when you talk about different types of social phenomena. Like, as a black male music teacher, I understand that I am in a special situation where I am black, not a lot of black teachers. I'm a man. There are male teachers, but not a lot in places that you would think they'd be needed the most. Let me make that very clear here, where it's totally possible for a man to be a kindergarten teacher. It's totally possible for a man to be an English teacher. And we know this to be true, but at the scale that we want to have, like, good representation, there's not a lot of men in education. There are men in education in positions of power. That's a totally different thing. But when it comes to educators, like, it's very sort of stigmatized based on what kind of field you want to be in. Like, a lot of people's exposure to a black teacher is in like physical education. usually, and that's not okay for me. So I guess my point here, to tie it back into this just like the overarching picture, like my frustration, is that we're seeing a pushback to certain ideas around racial and social construction, just social construction broadly. But when we get to the point where we have to really take like an objective look at the materials that are out there and what like the arguments are, the right, and it's the right, for a group that doesn't want to be identifiable, it's the right and Republicans who are introducing laws and bills that don't target anything that anyone's arguing. And maybe it does exist. Like I'll give some ground to my fellow righties out there who might just end up, the righties that want to listen to me, which like the Hunter Avalones out there. Listen, all the Hunter Avalone adjacents out there, listen to me. I see the argument, right? I see that there are teachers who are implementing curriculum that is just not really curriculum, but projects that are not age appropriate. And same thing. If you think it's bad for race, wait to look at the ones about sex. Oh, baby, buckle up. So they're all bad. Like there's no, like, I'm not going to sit here and say one's better than the other. However, there's like an understanding that in proper guidelines and proper curriculum guidelines, you might be able to create an educational topic that people will enjoy. No different than race. Not only enjoy, but be age appropriate. Mm-hmm. And that's always been the goal. So like that concern, I am in agreement with. I am in a full agreement that essentializing groups doesn't lead to good outcomes. No disagreements there. But the problem is when you start digging past level one of understanding these things, you start getting into places that might be very uncomfortable to deal with. And just because it's uncomfortable, that's the oxygen for some people, right? Like
what there do you mean like by that?
So I know that systemic racism exists. I've experienced not only interpersonal racism, but different types of structural racism. I'm able to look at it. I understand it. Why? I don't know. I think there's a very particular reason why these things might affect me. I don't know why. But so for me, that's So for me, that's my oxygen. No different than someone who's a woman representing that the discrimination that they may receive because of their gender is in the forefront. It's not something you can avoid. That's why I call it my oxygen. However, go for it.
Do you mean the discomfort, those uncomfortable conversations give you room to breathe? Is that what you're articulating, or am I misunderstanding you?
Sort of, where I can have these conversations in a way that understands like the delicacy of it. Mm-hmm. But that's because when I say it's my oxygen, it's just something I'm used to seeing and experiencing. Mm. So these things aren't new to me. Okay, so like when I see somebody, as an example, like when I see a parent second guess if I'm a teacher based on how I dress, I'm just used to that.
We always say it's the water you swim in. It's your world. I see what you're saying.
Yeah,
I'm following you now. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when like male presenting folks, I love y'all. Love you. Sometimes yikes. When I see something where very common examples when I see another colleague of mine sort of have questions about the dress code within my school district. And what that looks like is, as long as it is not distracting to the activity or the educational process, and that tends to be the wording in more sort of lax dress code policies. So you just see people dressing as people, however they want to express themselves. I have no issue with that. But I have some teachers who I used to work with who would be totally against that. And they would say things where it's like, well, I can see your navel. It's not appropriate. And it's like, if we break that down, why are you looking at a child's navel? So and when
Yeah.
and then it's like, what do you mean? It's there. And it's like, yeah, listen, as somebody who really likes booba, I can compartmentalize in my brain not to stare at booba all the time. Like it's possible to rewire your brain in such a way where you can see something and not have everything sort of stop in slow motion to acknowledge that it exists. like,
Yeah.
like, jeez.
Like, and that's to me that concern when it goes over the top, that's disruptive because I'm over there trying to get a school education, and I'd wear this one dress to school that had the shoulders down, but it was a long sleeve dress, long all the way down to the floor dress. It was a celebratory dress I would wear. And I had one of the older substitutes disrupt my whole day, have me all fucked up because he could see my shoulders. And it was very, very upsetting to him. So he sent me to the principal's office. And it's like, come on. We've got stuff to do. Why are my shoulders so upsetting?
Yeah, and something that school districts can do is have professionals who not only study these things, but make sort of their entire work designed around understanding these type of things and why we have these certain biases and prejudice towards things like shoulders, knees. I learned about knees apparently, thighs, like in terms of like for instance the ridiculous dress rule of like if you put your arms to your sides and that's how long your dress should be. And it's like, okay, what do you do with all the femme presenting and women out there with alligator arms? Or it's like, what do you do with that demographic of people? Like, clearly, if we equally apply this rule, it's not going to work. It's not going to work. Like, I've been there. My ex-girlfriend, bless her heart, she would talk about the hypocrisy of that rule because when she was like 5'1", when she put her arms to her sides, it stopped at her, whatever that middle, I don't know what it's called, but it's basically, it stopped like at her, like her abdomen area, like upper abdomen. She had short arms. So she's like, I just couldn't wear dresses because it couldn't go down that far. So it's like, I understand. And the thing is, it all is within a problem, right? There's an understanding that there's certain heights and I shouldn't say heights. There's certain ways of expressing yourself in a social setting that could be considered quote unquote sexually explicit. I understand the argument, but we can't get to what does sexually explicit actually look like if we're stuck at knees and side heights. Because like there is a point where you can say like, okay, this is definitely too far in terms of like what you could wear to school. And because the idea of like disrupted to an educational environment for me is very, very clear. And then like you get the straw man of, well, what's very clear? Well, can you go naked to school? And it's like, no. Great. There's a line. There's the far side. The far side's no clothes. Let's start adding clothes to see where our disagreements are. But then they go like, well, dresses, crop tops, rompers. It's like, wait, you want girls to be comfortable? Like, what is this?
No, I definitely feel that. Absolutely. I am so sorry, but we are already over time, and I really, really wanted to be able to get into one last question and answer a few other questions. I'm gonna have to have you on again.
Yeah,
we could definitely go into like men's liberation. We could go into how we see children and how we treat children and how that's shifted. And I'm sure even going into unions and your experience there would be really cool. But CRT is so broad, and then obviously they're broadening it even more just to include things regarding sex. I know it affects things like straight up discussions of race and racial discrimination, which is what I focused on a lot in college as a women's studies major. And then it's also central to our country's history. So naturally it'll be in history courses, but it's also relevant to literature, language, psychology, art, and music, if I'm correct. How does CRT tie into music?
So the argument that I give to get people on board, like, so, because if I have a mutual understanding that like I need to get people on this ship, it's a good ship, it's a great ship, not like the other types of ships that people use. Don't worry about those ships. Worry about this ship. So that was a dark slavery joke. Okay, so
oh jeez,
I'm just kidding. It wasn't a slavery joke. It's about those like creepy boats, like the COVID boat. No one was going on a COVID boat. Anyway, see, a little dark humor there. So I argue in terms of archives and active learning. So one of the things that is used within CRT in education is the concept of archives. What I mean by archives, libraries, educational texts, etc. All those things are not neutral. So there's no like objectivity within archival texts, and that idea, if we extrapolate it to the what people argue, is that it perpetuates and maintains white supremacy, and I would go as far as to agree with that. Now, if I understand that those two words might be too far for a lot of people, I would argue that it perpetuates and maintains whatever the norm is in society. So if the norm
is totally white supremacy.
Yeah. So like, and then like to really broaden it, right? It's not really broaden it, but like maybe reduce the Bloody Mary here, is that to get to the tomato of the drink, you could say on one hand, okay, it's just maintaining what we already do in society. So if we already don't talk about race, then whatever our archival texts do, we'll also not talk about race. Mm-hmm. And then what that is also within education is the idea of like readjusting the show and tell mentality that comes in teaching. And I think music is in the forefront of that, where there is show and tell, but music always has in the forefront the need to apply what you're doing. So as an example, I can teach anybody how to play a C major scale, but you're not teaching the C major scale in a vacuum. You're teaching the C major scale because it's a pattern that exists everywhere in music, and it's a pattern that exists at different points and in different types of scenarios. So something that, if we were to tie it into being an active learner, is what I do with my students, right, is have them do their own exercises. So like, okay, this is a C major scale. I'm going to give you another, like, so this is the scale, this is fact. Fact number 2, you won't always see this in the way that it's structured right now. So what's a way that you could work on it at home? And it's like, I could do it in thirds. Okay, so do it in thirds. I'm going to go a little bit musical here. So it's like, okay, so C, E, D, F, E, G, F, A, etc. Okay, cool. You just played it in thirds. What's another way you can do it? Oh, playing it in fourths? Okay, C, F, D, etc. Like, so it's like you understand that this is the pattern. These are the notes within it that exists. You understand that this won't always exist in the way that I see it. So why don't I work on it in different ways to get used to having it not only in my fingers, but in my brain. Mm-hmm. So when I see it in the real world, I won't look surprised. Mm-hmm. And this is like the one thing that I try my best to instill, this idea of like, through active learning and practice, when you get to the situation, you won't be stumbling through a complicated line. If you were able to work and break it down in different ways, when you see it in a way that looks abstract, you can go, oh, that's just a C major scale starting on the 5. And then it descends down to the 2 and then back up to the 7. All right, boom. I just saved myself about 5 hours of practice in terms of like compartmentalizing that. And that's what music education does, and music generally does. The idea that like we had to readjust the approach to education, and really the teacher is just the guide. Like, and the only difference between me as a teacher and a student is that I just have more years on them. That's it. I'm by no stretch of the imagination smarter than my students. They make that incredibly clear every day. Like we had a graduating senior this year. He took his SAT and I think it was in like the top 1 percentile, whatever that like point, whatever the one that's like you want for like big schools. He got that in 8th grade. And the entire
kids are wild right now.
Yeah, and
They're absolutely wild.
Yeah, it's like and the only difference between him and I is that I've just seen things longer than he has. Mm-hmm. So I'm like, when I say to like my students, hey, you probably want to get to rehearsal maybe 40 minutes before it actually starts. And it's like, well, why 40 minutes? That feels so long. And it's like, well, what would you rather have? Me and be annoyed when you walk through the door at 2:15 for a 2:00 hit, or me busting your chops for being early. Like, I'd rather bust people's chops for being early than I would have them like scrambling towards the gun. Because like I try to tell them, like, I know what it feels like to be comfortable and have time to do other things. So if you can, strive for that. If you can't, I get it. Like, but that's the thing, like, when it comes to, like, there is a level of, like, rigidness of, like, okay, like, you have to learn this, you have to learn that. But after that, it can be very expressive. And so the idea of reimagining the show, and, like, the idea of, when I say show and tell, it's the idea of, like, saying, and I'm going to use the meme here, 1 + 1 is 2. Write it down. Mm-hmm. That's the answer. Where in music, it's everything like, hold on. I have an example here. So this is, but this is the way I drive it home too. So this is, or one of the ways. So this album I have here is from John Coltrane. It's called Both Directions at Once. Really, really good. But I'm going to put up here. I don't know if you can see that on your end.
Yeah.
But there's 3 songs in a row. Here's a spoiler. It's the exact same song. And it's multiple takes of the exact same song. Song's impressions. So we have impressions take 1 at 4 minutes and 6 seconds. Impressions take 2, 4 minutes and 37 seconds. Impression take 4, 3 minutes and 40 seconds. In music, we never get the same thing twice. Unless it's like an actual produced piece of music that you can just hit play and redo it. But even then, that moment of how that song was constructed and the way it was, and how the notes lined up the way that it did, that is just a blink in time and it's gone forever. So, and this is another frustration when it comes with an education, and will make music hard to track, is that we're not tracking, we can't say that by this point you're going to learn bop, 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 and bop. Maybe we could try that, but in reality, it's just like, it's a never-ending journey. So, like, one of the things that when I talk about, like, going away, the show and tell mentality, it's the idea that this never ends. And the way that you perform and the way that you have somebody next to you is only going to be a blink in time. Like, you're going to have more time by yourself than you are with an instructor next to you. So you want to create a system and regiment where, and as a teacher, where you have students be their right?
Be their what?
Be their own knowledge producers. So teaching students, hey, I know this Donald Trump quote sounds very, very, very hyperbolic, but it comes from somewhere. Now, how do you find where that comes from? Right? I bring up the transgender service members ban as example, where on one hand, his tweet seems incredibly inflammatory, which it is. But what is actually getting targeted? That requires looking into, okay, what did the State Department say here? What did somebody say that maybe in the service that said a quote, maybe out of context in a Fox News interview? And then in reality, it's like, oh, they were just looking to not, I'm going to underrepresent what's happening here just for the sake of the argument. It's like, oh, they were just targeting one part of healthcare that exists within service members who are transgender. But then somehow it extrapolated to a full ban on transgender troops. How did it get to that point? And that's what something like CRT allows you to do, is that being able to look at something and go, okay, this is not objectively true, which is going to make some people uncomfortable when I say that, but what are the other things that are true at the same time as an initial statement or initial idea, right? So you can say that the best way I can describe it is people can say America is the best country ever, but also you can simultaneously say America has done incredible atrocities across the world. Both for people can be true, right? like those worlds can both exist. It's not this idea that one doesn't exist. Like, no, these two things for people can exist at the same time. No different than I can say, like, although slavery was a disgusting thing and should never happen again, there were some gems and things that were beautiful that came out of it. But just because something beautiful came out of it doesn't mean we don't stop it from ever happening again. Exactly. So it's like cool, we got music as we know it because of slavery. But if I had to choose between the music that we have it today and abject slavery, I'm going to get rid of slavery every single time. And that's just my moral compass of it, right? Sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you. I'm going to be honest. I was following you there and I was like, where did we go? And then we got here.
Yeah.
Is this the beauty of being an educator or what?
It's the beauty of dealing with me. So something like to do a soft plug of my stuff, something that my streams are they're tricky. And I'm learning that the hard way because I always try my best to stop to go somewhere in order to give full context. The problem is, we could, as my stream community knows, Michael Mistaken, I see him in chat. He's a great submarino. He knows pretty well that we'll start on something and we'll end up somewhere else. And for somebody coming in late to the party, we have no idea how we got there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I feel that 100%.
Yeah. And that's even if we tie it into the idea of like critical race theory and the idea of understanding things. Sometimes you need to stop and go back to explain something in order just to get back to where you are.
Absolutely.
And even when I was doing the research in the critical race theory and trying to figure out, okay, where did this culture war discourse start? We had to go all the way back to, not really all that far back, to September 2020 and Christopher Rufo. And then we could work our way forward. And then when you work your way back and forward, you start getting flashpoints. You get the flashpoints of the different just cringe, socially and culturally inappropriate lessons that people do across the United States. You get a giant explosion in Loudoun County, Virginia. And then the thing is, within that explosion of Loudoun County, Virginia, you get people who end up being the faces of that discourse. And then, okay, let's follow the faces of that discourse to see like what these individuals are talking about within this. And you get what I'm trying to say?
I think so.
Yeah, where one, as Michael just brings up, a 56-second video can lead to 8 hours worth of content.
Absolutely. No, absolutely.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are over time. So do you have a few like quick bullet points you would say, like ways that critical race theory plays into music? Because I think it plays in like critical race theory. And as you were saying, with slavery in America, does that play into music? How music was formulated? What about, I know you can talk the strings and classical music, the history of classical music, jazz music. What?
Yeah, and
I feel like we could probably have our own whole stream on that though.
Yeah, and even just the the way that we express music, right? Where, and I challenge my students with this all the time, of like changing how you arrange your room for a performance that you want to do. And that's something one of my teachers taught me, where what's wrong with people being people at your performance? Like, why, like, who, like, I'm going to be very blunt here. Who gives a fuck if you're playing Beethoven or if you're playing Coltrane? It's music, so let people express themselves how they want to express themselves in the performance.
Yeah.
So, like, why is it that? And then it's funny, like, why is it that we create jazz as a social thing, and the social thing that you're allowed to, you know, be at restaurants and have people eating around you and talking about themselves, but then for these group of Western European composers, there's this idea of like, we mustn't talk, we mustn't say anything, we must enjoy the art as we enjoy it. It's like, no, like if you think something is cool and you want to express yourself in the middle, have at it. Like there's no, like, there's something human that got lost within European music, which is expressing yourself. So like, and another thing that I drive home to tie in within CRT, in other cultures, moving with your body with music is something that's just in there. Like connecting yourself in a way, because the way that I was taught is that this thing over here is just an extension of my body, so it should be part of me. And if being part of me means it's moving with me, then so be it. That's fine. But like, it's so like what CRT teaches, and like when we're talking about from the historical context, it's like, okay, like why do we tap our foot when we play? Why do we feel the need to rock back and forth when we play? Like that's things that you can use educationally to have like whole topics about in terms of teaching. But also, like, why do we have it so that when somebody wants to have a solo or perform a solo, we put them into the forefront, right? Like, and that's something that really got people uncomfortable in my personal experience. So I went to a concert. I went to a concert a year ago at this point, and the conductor, who was black, and he was also a music director, he opted for the performers. Well, first off, the seating arrangement was wild. We were seated with the audience was seated with the ensemble. So we were all just like in the music, literally, like with players wild next to us. The second thing was he didn't have soloists stand. Instead, they just played their solo with them where they were at in the seat, and that really made people uncomfortable. Mainly it's white people that are really uncomfortable, but basically this idea of like, why are we organizing this way that's just different? I don't understand it. Like, what if I need to get up and do something? It's like, nothing's stopping you to get up and go to the bathroom if you need to. Like, and then like the idea of like, I don't see the soloist. Like, well, why do you need to see the soloist? If you can hear them, then what's going on here? Now, granted, like I'm going to give a little bit of floor there, in that there is something to be said for the deaf community in terms of being able to see a performer and stuff like that. That's another totally different part of this conversation. But
it seems like, sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
But it seems like it's really, what I'm getting is it's about shaking up the status quo and not leaving that assumption that we're leaving. Okay, yeah. That's
so
and it makes things, it leaves so much more room for creativity, which is so necessary in music.
Exactly. And then like when we talk about just like the archives and tackling the music, maybe as teachers we have to do more to be our own knowledge producers. And it's like, okay, if I don't know a lot about women in music, I should probably dedicate a lot of my time to that, because no different than if we were dedicating our time to something we don't know musically, we should probably be dedicating ourselves somewhere in time. So when a teacher asks us because personally, I'm tired of individuals citing like Amy Beach, Clara Schumann. Like it's just like those two, and those like exclusively the only feminine composers, when there's a sea of women who were doing incredible things in music, but due to other social reasons in the 1800s and 1900s that may have prevented music from women coming out. I don't know. Might have something to do with the fact that, I don't know. Something to do with abject discrimination.
People weren't trained in it, right?
Yeah.
You've got to get training in it to be able to be involved. I mean, I don't know the history of that, but I know that we're getting out of a lot of areas.
Yeah, where on one hand you could say exactly that, but then there's like the other conversation of, okay, if there are a sea of Black women who are responsible for teaching children everything, including things like piano, string, all of this stuff. Maybe they're and I'm throwing like this kind of dog whistly, but maybe there are millions upon millions of female composers whose voices didn't get heard because they were literally slaves. So it's like, and that's the point that CRT is trying to do, is that, hey, our experience and the experience of others is centered around one thing. So let's try our best to challenge that center and make it bigger. So, and there's nothing wrong with that. We're not trying to send all white people back to their countries of origin or something crazy like that.
Wait, but are you sure?
Oh, yeah. Wait, who's
really?
saying that? Exactly.
No, I totally hear you.
Yeah, like,
it's absurd.
Yeah, it's these absurd just straws, and I understand the apprehension, right? I understand the apprehension of going down a road educationally that's uncomfortable. I get that part of it. Like it is uncomfortable. Like what happens to music teachers and educators more broadly who just don't get it or just not down with it. You know, like the ones that like, this is the way I've been teaching. This is the way I've been teaching all the time. I'm not going to change it. What's going to happen to them? That's a question to be had. What's going to happen to, like, how do we make sure that these curriculums are being taught in such a way that's age appropriate? Like that's on the community to make sure that these institutions are held accountable, but also, while we need to make sure the institutions are held accountable by the people, we have to make sure that the people's arguments around the apprehensions are consistent with what reality is. So if we're banning things that don't exist, what are we doing? Like,
exactly.
It's like, we can't teach that one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex.
Well, we haven't been, so thank you.
Yeah, it's like,
thank
exactly.
you for spending a good amount of time on something we really work.
Yeah, it's like GOP. About. Thank you so much for just in case we ever get to that point, we can refer to this, but we're pretty far from even anyone making that claim, or even meritocracy, or traits such as hard work ethic, or racist or sexist, or were created by members of a particular race to oppress members of another race.
I would like to dig into the conversation around meritocracy more, but we have a few questions in queue. We need to get through those, and I will have to have you on again because I feel like we could dig into so much. Yeah,
and that's the thing about this too. Like, then I'll shut up for a bit and answer some stuff. Like, there's just a lot to it. Like, even within CRT, in terms of the discourse around it, there's just a lot, and it's unfortunate that even now in this like conversation that we had, it's like just the surface of this culture war that the right is doing, and it sucks because there's so many people doing great work in equity and equality and education, but this dissenting opinion doesn't care about CRT, and they're just using it for political power to get seats back. I wish it wasn't that way, you know?
Yeah, it is very, very unfortunate. So first question.
Hey, there we go.
I think this should be a pretty easy one. This is from Jay. What's a Google school? And this is something I was wondering too, but I didn't want to interrupt
Oh, so I call Google schools where more than 95% of the student body uses Chromebooks. So our district, all the way that it works is that you get a Chromebook, I think starting in eighth grade, I want to say. And then that's the Chromebook that you just have throughout school. And then that Chromebook gets passed down. So what they do is like when you graduate, you return your Chromebook that you have. They make any necessary like hardware and software updates, and that goes off to another student. And that just the cycle continues. So what that does is it allows you to have like the entire Google ecosystem of Classroom, Meet, Drive, the other ones I can't think of that no one ever uses. And that ecosystem allows teaching to be something where you can have like, oh, I sent the homework in Classroom. Like it's in Classroom. Oh, I when we're doing like meets, we're going to use Google Meet because we all have Google, like our school account is also connected to Google. So like that's what I mean by Google, a Google school.
Thank you. This is not a question in queue. Do you know Professor Melko?
Professor Melko? Yes, I do.
Professor Melko just rated us. Hey, welcome.
Hey.
Does Professor Melko know you?
They rated my community as well.
All right.
Yeah, Melko's good people. Melko's good people.
Welcome. You're catching us right at the end of our interview. We're answering a few questions. We had a bit of a chat on music education and critical race theory and how those two come together. Joe has been dropping a lot of knowledge, so you probably already follow Joe, but if you don't, please go give Joe a follow. This interview, if you want to catch it, will be up on my YouTube, assuming Joe's cool with that. And
I'm already on the internet in other ways, so.
All right, cool. And then we're going to get back into our questions because we're just wrapping up a little bit, but feel free to add any if you have any. Eco Talking wanted to know, do you think there is a gatekeeping of music from those who don't read music or know music theory?
Yes. All the time. Oh, sorry. That's just, we call them classical musicians who just make fun of jazz music. Yes. It's better now than ever before. But there is a stigma about reading music and playing and like reading music versus like other types of expression. But spoiler alert, some of your favorite musicians in the world who are touring musicians are not good readers.
I feel like that's so nice to know too, because, you know, as I said, I'm a string player, play the violin, and I did have a very, like, I was one of the fortunate few that my dad, you know, he worked in a factory, but he would pick up all these other jobs so that I could afford to go and get a private lesson because our school didn't offer violin. And so it was very classical and very music based. But I always felt like, is it possible to break out and do things that aren't so reading music based? Because it feels so clunky and strict. I was like, there's got to be another way to do this. And there are musicians out there doing that.
Yeah, and even to tie this home a little bit of history knowledge, right, is the idea of figure bass. Figure bass is a way of music notation where you just have a bass line and then numeric symbols and different types of symbols underneath that bass line in order to make music. And that's it. And a lot of the music that you would hear when people think of like Bach and like church music, it's all improvised. So while you do have a structure underneath that you're working under and a bass line to work under, everything on top has still a structure into it. Like if you see like an E with a 6 underneath, that's a very specific chord you have to play over that, but everything else is up for interpretation. So and on top of that, if we go into the idea of jazz, right, you just have a shell, and the shell is the lead sheet, the lead of the chart, the head, so to speak, and that head can create 10 to 20 minute just pieces of expression. And while I will say it is important to know how to read, it's not the end all be all. Like, could you get gigs if you don't read music? Absolutely. Would you get gigs if you could read music? Absolutely. Those can still stay true, but the emphasis is a little bit different. Like, I'm not going to teach one of my drum students. I teach my drum students how to do music notation for sure. But if they're listening to their favorite song, like for instance, like Doja Cat just dropped something, and one of my students wants to play something on it. I forget the name of it, but it's like a soca beat. Like, I'm not going to like. It's faster to transcribe it by ear than it would be for us to sit down and have to labor through how we were to write that. Because if I were to teach her how to write that, and also wait for her to write it for it to make sense, we'll be there forever. But if this is what she wants to do and she wants to play this, then a muscle you have to flex and work on is how can I hear something once and replicate it? And we do that all the time.
Yeah.
So it's just another different application.
It kind of reminds me of, this is such maybe a silly direction to go, but cooking. I was very stuck in recipes. But once I started to be able to put things together myself, going to a restaurant and trying a food, and then being able to go home and want to try something similar, just being able to witness it, experience it, and then come back and make it or my own variation of it is so freeing. It's so creative. It's so cool.
And again, it's much like culinary arts and cooking. It's the journey that gets you there, right? And while you're looking for an answer, which would be the thing that you want to eat or the thing that you want to play, the way that you get there can be totally different. And the thing that's crazy about it, and why culinary is a great example, is we do this all the time. When we have an idea of how we need to get somewhere, but we don't have directions. We have an idea of what my favorite streamer's layout was, but I don't know how to do layouts. I've never done a layout my whole life. Well, let me figure that out using just my knowledge of troubleshooting. I don't like, if I'm listening to a melody from my favorite song, the only reason why we know nah, because we've been drilling that in our brain nonstop and applying it in different exactly, and just applying it in different places. Like, that's the only reason. That's the only way we can learn and retain things. Like, we're not gonna have something in front of our face all the time in order to like be able to like. Is it great? Sure. Yeah, that's my rant on reading. You don't read music, it's fine. It's fine. Your favorite musician probably is a bad reader too. I'm looking at the Taylor Swifts out there. They're not good readers. Spoiler alert.
All right, this one is from Consteller for the debate you had about CRT where you were having the panel argue the tenets. What is the name of the book that it came from?
Yes, that is from Critical Race Theory and Introduction. That was written by Gene Stefanik and Richard Delgado. It's a great stepping off point. I think it's like 500 pages. It's pretty big. But it's a great resource to have if you're looking for a center place to start. Now, I'm going to make a disclaimer here. Don't let that centerpiece be what you use as an encapsulation of everything, right? So within the framing of that debate that I had, I use that as level 1 because that's, for me, level 1. But if you're not down with level 1, then you're probably going to have some objections later on. So that's why I did that debate that way, or I tried to approach it that way, where it's like, okay, here are the tenets that are laid out in the beginning of this book, this text. So let's hash out what we can here and then move to the other stuff, which for debates and stuff on the internet, it's unattractive. I get it. We want to argue and hear people yelling at each other and calling each other white. I get it. It feels great too. I've called people white online before. It feels amazing. But it doesn't go. It can only go so far, right? So if we want to get to, if I want to get
to the actual discussion with some actual education and knowledge, rather than shut up, you're white. Like
like as another example, to a very quick one, like the kink at Pride. There is a very memery conversation that could be had around that because certain phenomena that people object to doesn't exist. And I love to joke about the things that people think exist at Pride parades that doesn't exist. I love memeing like that. But at the same time, it's like, okay, let's get our laughs out about people just not understanding what's going on so we can have the real conversation. There's always a point for that. Because as a DJ at Pride Parades, I don't see kink. I don't see it. I did 3 this year, didn't see it. Like, I don't like, unless it's being hidden underneath pizza basements or something. I don't know. Little dark there. I'm sorry.
I'm here for it. Whenever I need my dose of dark humor, I'm gonna call you up. Okay, like, Joe, I need you on this panel. I need someone to make a dark joke.
Yeah, but that's the point, right? Where it's like there's the really like just ridiculous conversation that people think is actual reality. But then there's like, okay, and then you have like everybody at Pride Parades going, this doesn't happen. And then even if we have things
arguing about,
and like, and even if you have things like, as example, BDSM in certain Pride events, it is a sectioned off portion that's very clear in terms of their guidelines, very clear about who goes in and who goes out. So it's not just going to be like Timmy lost his rainbow balloon and landed into a BDSM panel. Like, that's not how that shit works.
I'm pretty sure that's exactly how it works.
Jeez.
Alrighty. And with
so the answer to that question, critical race theory and introduction, Gene Stefanik, Rachel Delgado.
Thank you, Joe. And last question from me. How do you wish people, parents, students, and other concerned community members would support you and teachers across the states, educators across the states, in regards to what's going on with critical race theory and these bans and just the conversations around race and sex that pop up, the hard conversations we are taking on as a society?
Yeah, I think step one, I forgot this was a question. Step one, if America, and this is kind of like my mantra, it's difficult to talk about race. You can replace this with whatever you want in terms of social construction in America, because Americans disagree on the history of race. So what happens is we get caught up in the disagreements on the history without kind of talking about the nitty gritty of it. Like an example of like slavery. Well, it's about states' rights. Well, it's really more about states' rights to own slaves. But it's like, well, actually,
what?
Yeah, well, actually, if you look at this document from this person, this like, no, stop, let's pull back. So, if we understand that there's going to be disagreements there, we need to, in internal conversations, interpersonal, catch ourselves when we start losing astray, right? Like, listen, I love me as somebody who is a classical clarinetist. And that's where I started out as. I love me some dead white guys. But there's going to be a point where when you start it doesn't matter how many times you use Marx in your argument, he is not going to come out of the ground and argue with you. So when you're talking about race, talking about Marx doesn't really do much. So with the dissenting opinion of like, it's just a Marxist ideology, we can't dig him up and find out what he really means by X, Y, and Z. And it's like, oh, well, Marx was a racist. Cool. Sure, I guess. But that's not talking about the institution that we live in the United States when it comes to race. So let's keep the conversation centered. And so when I say keep the conversation centered, like when you're seeing these arguments happen, like a good mental thing is like to catch when it starts losing itself, right? If we're talking about, for instance, gender pronouns in schools, and even though people are using CRT as like the next stepping stone of like, and this is why I don't agree with CRT, it's like, hang on, stop. What's your objection with gender pronouns? Don't use CRT as your dissenting part of your dissent. We're talking about this argument. Like, so what's your objection with gender pronouns in school? And if your objection is within critical race theory, then let's talk about critical race theory. So it's unfortunate to say the read 5-head take, but one thing that people can do in the general is listen to the like easiest thing that you can do, take somebody's name of somebody talking about CRT, like a CRT author or scholar, just put their name in Google It's praxis, I promise you. Put their name in Google, go to videos, and change it to relevance and time 20 minutes or more. What you'll find is that a lot of these people who are within CRT are also educators. And the one thing that all educators love to do, they love talking about the stuff they study. We just love it. So you're going to have extended 1 hour, 2 hour conversations about what these individuals talk about within their field of study, why they study it, things that they discovered, and just watch that content. And then from there, it's like, oh, this interests me. Cool. Then read about it. Read about like the things that they're talking about. Maybe read about the very people that they reference, because spoiler alert, a lot of the CRT scholars are also teachers to their teachers and teachers to their students. There's like a tree of education here where like it starts with one educator. Those students go off to get older, like Kimberly Crenshaw, and then they have students, and those students go off and doing great work. No different than literally any other field. It's no different. And if reading isn't your cup of tea, it's not for me. Audiobooks.
Yeah, that's where I'm at. Audiobooks, podcasts, YouTube.
Yeah. And then also, again, look at things objectively. And I'm only on the interpersonal part. Like, just look at things objectively. Understand that there's a dissenting opinion. And and when I say it's a dissenting opinion, it's very consistent. It's a dissenting opinion that is incredibly consistent. So understand what the popular dissenting opinion is, and then you can start weeding out those who are arguing in good faith against things like certain curriculum implications. Like, there are good dissenting arguments, but they're in a sea of the exact same rhetorical arguments, which is great for us. So like, we know, like, okay, if they start talking about Marx, here's the big one, right? If I'll give you the praxis. If you're watching something about critical race theory and you see something about Dr. Ibram X. Kendi or Dr. Robin DiAngelo, congratulations, you can turn off that content. So like, and move on to the next thing. Now, like, and what I mean by that is Dr. Ibram X. Kendi is a race historian who talks about the history of race. His books talk about the history of race. There's a little bit of interjection with CRT, but not really enough. And he doesn't describe himself as a CRT scholar. So if they say CRT scholar, Ibram X. Kendi, turn it off. If they say Robin DiAngelo, CRT scholar, turn it off. She's a whiteness scholar. Robin DiAngelo is a whiteness Robin DiAngelo, whiteness scholar. No different than Joe Fagan, who wrote of the White Racial Frame.
I have a question. So when you're talking about like I know Robin DiAngelo wrote like White Fragility, right? She was someone who went around to different corporations, I think, and was doing like racial sensitivity trainings with her and one other person or something. What do you mean when you say whiteness scholar versus like critical race theory?
So whiteness studies is a field of expertise that specifically talks about this, in this case, whiteness, are the structures, practices, and policies that produce white privilege. So their expertise is around the structures, practices, and policies. That's why when you listen to Robin DiAngelo's charged language towards white people, first understand she has very charged language. So just listen. Women can be mad too, and women can be aggressive on a topic. Whoa, crazy. I know. So just let's get that microaggression out of the way, right? Like, and the charged rhetoric, just get that out of your brain. Listen to her argument and listen to how she talks about whiteness, because she talks about it in terms of structures and certain practices that produce white privilege. So that's all whiteness and whiteness studies does. It just analyzes those practices, which is different than critical race theory, because critical race theory is, and this is where people get lost, It's the analysis of race as it relates to social, political, and economic structures. Just Robin DiAngelo talking about whiteness, the practices, policies, and other word I can't remember that produces white privilege. Is there possible intersection with critical race theory? Yes. And I'd be foolish to say otherwise. But to say that she is a critical race theory scholar that makes her work and the work within whiteness studies and the work within critical race theory, it just doesn't do a service to either of those two. So you got to be like, the reason why I say like, congratulations, you can turn it off. Like you can watch Robin DiAngelo if you want, but just you have to frame it that, okay, she's a whiteness studies scholar and she's talking about this within whiteness. And when you look at the laws that are being implemented, a lot of them really only read white fragility and maybe only read the abstract and maybe watched a couple of her videos, which again, you can watch that content, but like there's other scholars that are out there in the field. But if you're going to argue critical race theory, then you have to look at the people who either self-describe themselves as critical race theorists or are people who over time were cited to be the forefront within that work, within those works. Like Gene Stefanik, Richard Delgado, Kimberly Crenshaw, Mary Matsuda. Like these are all people that you can go to and listen to how they talk and argue.
So would sorry to interrupt. Would the kind of equivalent be listening to a men's liberationist rather than like a feminist scholar?
Yeah, in a way, right?
Kind of breaking down like. So I see men's liberationists as breaking down and understanding like men and the role that they have been placed into and the way that is maintained and breaking that down. But you have all of this understanding of like what's happening with femininity and like the feminist movement. Would that be an equivalent?
Yeah. Where it's like, within each of these analyses of social structures and constructs, there's so much social phenomena that you can have an entire study dedicated to that. That's why you can have men's liberation and women's liberation side by side in terms of analysis. Because and
they overlap and they intersect and they do all that, but they are still separate.
Right. And again, like just because we separate the two doesn't diminish, like intersectionality never disappears where there's going, and even identity politics, like there's still going to be overlapping things that exist within separate studies. But just because they overlap doesn't mean they're the same. Well, it's like, and we already, just because it has sugar, just because my drink has sugar in it and corn syrup doesn't make it a Slurpee. It's like there's a particular, and you can have a Slurpee and a soda. Like you can have a soda Slurpee, like a Coca-Cola Slurpee, and a Coca-Cola side by side. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, Joe.
Because that's what's happening.
That's fair.
Yeah, like and that's what's happening. Like, and then it's like, okay, well, one of these isn't the same, so let's figure out why. And like even like when we talk about the strife of black and African Americans, that's totally different than the strife of Indigenous Americans. But then what happens is there's intersection because some of the systems that we're both fighting have a neutral source. So kind of like I meme about it, but it's kind of it's kind of a telling different interpretation of a scene that I'm about to spoil in Avengers Endgame, right? When all the heroes, spoiler alerts, for the one person who hasn't seen it yet. But,
hey, that's me. I'm the one person.
Right? Okay, so one person who hasn't seen it. For me. Yeah. So there's a scene where all these heroes just pan across multiple movies, and to me that is literally intersectionality in a shot, where it's all these individuals across multiple films see a unified threat. That unified threat is going to influence all of them in different ways. But that doesn't mean all these other groups don't come together. And that's what's happening. You have like one villain, Thanos. All these people have different interactions and relationships with Thanos based on how he oppressed them. So now they're coming together because, hey, we all have different experiences, but we can come together to work towards a common goal. We can even have disagreements after the fact. No different than Indigenous Americans and Black Americans.
I'm mad that I don't have superpowers, though, to fuck you up when we are having those disagreements. What the heck?
Yeah. Like, as an example, like, sometimes when you hear Black Americans talk, people go like, well, what about the Indigenous? What about the Native Americans? Yeah, they're included too. They didn't stop being included in our strife. Yeah. And it's like Mexican Americans, like non-white Americans, white ethnic minorities. Like, that intersectionality doesn't stop when you charge a group up with different terms and identifiers. When people go like, well, what about Jewish Americans, Joe? What about their strife in the United States? And it's like, yeah, no shit. It sucked for them too. And as we learned, I'm sure as you saw on my stream, like the strife of Jehovah's Witnesses during World War II also has some intersectionality with Jewish Americans during World War II. And we literally had to have multiple Supreme Court precedent to say, hey, maybe people can choose not to say the flag if they don't want to. But it took seas of violence to get there. But like nobody would like think for a second, like, wait a minute, like where do Jehovah's Witnesses have to do with the strife of disenfranchisement in the United States in the 30s and 40s? And then it's like, well, what if I told you Jehovah's Witnesses were being lynched and murdered at mass for not saluting the American flag? Intersectionality. It's like, but yeah, like these groups have overlap, and that's okay.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Was there anything additional you wanted to add to the how can people support those teachers? I feel like you covered so much on that. I got, you know, go out, educate yourself, do some reading. If you can't do some reading, here are some voices you can go look up and listen to lectures from. And then have those conversations and don't get pulled in those weird directions. I'd say when it's getting wild.
I'd say the final thing, probably the most important thing, is, and this is the tough one, I'm going to be very honest here. We are all politically, socially, and economically apathetic to our conditions, and they manifest themselves in different ways. But the one thing that we can do is try our best every day and kind of ask the question, what am I doing to be more active in my community? It could be a big thing, like running for public office. It could be a small thing, like I went to go to my local pizzeria for the guy who's owned this business in my township for 50 years.
I'm gonna have giving to take my money off my stream again for being too based. Too based. Get out of here.
And it's okay. And the thing is that we spend so much time fighting over our political apathy and economic and social apathy to each other. Like, spoiler, we all are. We do it at different points, and that's great about being human. Because there's dissonance. We're allowed to have dissonance in our life. It's like, how can you be streaming about women's rights and intersectionality when you're a streamer? How can you be a leftist when you're streaming on Twitch? No different than how Obama can say he supports black people and he's the president of the United States. No different than how, like, everybody has different level, like, we still gotta do stuff. So I get it. But with that being said, like, one thing that we can do, especially anybody who has a student in this, like, okay, because I'm talking to the left community, if you pay taxes, and really, if you're a member of a community, I'm memeing there, but if you're a member of a community and if you have especially if you have a student in the school system, you got to go to Board of Education meetings. That's where the party's at. It's boring. I promise you, it's boring. So boring. but it's important. It's because if we got to remember, and this is like the biggest takeaway, the laws that are existing within CRT and the restrictions can happen in two places, three actually, if you're being really, really specific. They can be at the federal level, they can be at the state level, and they can be at the local level. And all of those entities have oversighting committees. So you can have a situation where, this school district has very good curriculum and very good guidance around critical race theory, and not even critical race theory, but just proper, not only proper education, but like they have a good history curriculum that talks about all the intersecting issues around the United States. Maybe they haven't had to worry about this at all, and they're doing a great job of teaching equity. Well, surprise, the Board of Education, their school board in their own district just voted to get rid of the things I mentioned earlier, and now it makes their job harder. Mm-hmm. But maybe it doesn't happen at the school board level. Maybe that happens at the state level. So the state legislature restricts the thing across the entire board, making their job harder. Or the restriction comes as federal guidance from the United States government, which then gets readapted at the state level, which then gets readapted at the local level. So these problems can just stack themselves if you're not careful. Meaning that you can have states, depending on how laws work, can just make an attorney general can just make guidance, and that guidance can be legally binding. But I want to get people more pilled on being activated earlier, right? So don't get like, and this is the thing why it's like, don't get mad that your superintendent of your school district is getting like $1 million raise. During the meeting, they vote on his contract. Get upset when the proposal happens a year and a half prior. Like, don't get upset that tuition is getting, I'm very careful when I say this. Don't get upset about tuition getting raised in your university when there were multiple tuition meetings across the entire year. And the meeting for public comment never changed. Like, don't get mad at when they have to put ink on paper, right? Like when they have to sign their name on it. Like, be there when they're having these conversations. And that's how things can get done. And the CRT dissenters know that. So they know that like the summer is when people calm down. And in Loudoun County, they're still having meetings about stopping CRT. They're still talking about it. And it's tough. I get that. Like, it's tough when we are doing all this other stuff and the capitalist machine is bringing the people down. Like, I get it. I'm there too. Mm-hmm. So, but that's you want to keep.
Work we've got to do.
Yeah, that's the hard stuff, right? When it's like no different. Where I just posted an article on my Twitter of an inmate who is an undocumented person who's on his, I think, 120th day or 26th day on a hunger strike about the conditions in these detention centers. Like, those stories aren't going to be heard in the discourse. But what we can do is make sure stories like that get amplified and situations like that get amplified. And within all of our communities, there's some type of drama going down. I promise you. It could be something as mundane as streetlights or something as serious as critical race theory. But a lot that people need is just to show that people care, right? Like, it takes one person to dance to a song to get that other person who's like in the back of the club, like, oh, I like this song too. Let me dance too. And then enough people and you have a full dance floor. So
someone has to start. Someone has to take that step.
Yeah. And I promise you, it's not just you. As CRT showed, it's not just you. You're not the only one who's like, man, I really don't want my state to end up banning race and gender within education and gender pronoun gender affirmation more broadly. I really hope that doesn't happen to my state. Well, guess what? You can go to a Board of Education meeting and just express your opinion during public comment. Absolutely. And then you can, if you're there enough, it could be 5 minutes out of your day, bi-weekly, where at 7 o'clock, I go, say my piece. 7 o'clock, I go say my piece. And then when it finally fits the fan, it's in their minds. So they're not doing these sort of like hyperbolic reactions, you know?
Absolutely. Thank you, Joe, so much. We managed to keep you an hour longer than intended.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
Thank you so much for your time. I will definitely have to reach out to you and have you on again soon. I really appreciate it. And best of luck with the marching band rehearsal.
It's going to be fun. Fire, fun.
I bet
Both start with F.
All right.
Fires can be fun.
Have a lovely day. Thank you so much, Joe.
You too. Take care. How do I end this call? Okay, there we go.
Everyone, if you don't already follow Joe, I would really, really appreciate it if you would swing over and drop J0e Lewis a follow. You know, we covered so much in that interview. I did not, and we didn't even hit, like, I had to cut out questions because there was just so much. So we'll definitely have to be having Joe on again. But in the meantime, please get over to his stream. I know when I swing by, I was learning stuff about music history and classical music and string players. It's very, very interesting. He has an incredible perspective, and you know, I guess someone said he's famous for his I don't know the word they use, but he goes out and I'm like, where are we going? We just go on this whole journey and then we bring it back around and I'm like, wow, how did that happen? So it's really incredible. Hugely recommend.